Hey everyone, welcome back to Bloody Angola. I'm your host Jim Chapman, continuing the series 50 Shades of Evil. I'm taking you back to Nebraska for a second time for this one, and we're going to go to the evening of November 15th, 2017, when a 24-year-old woman named Sidney Loof stood in her Lincoln, Nebraska apartment and did something millions of people do every single day. She opened up a dating app. She checked her messages and she got ready for a second date. Now, she even posted a Snapchat story. In the caption, it was simple. It was ordinary. She just put, "Ready for my date," with a picture of herself. Sidney had already met this woman once. The first evening had gone well. She had told a friend she thought she may have found her dream girl. The woman on the other end of the messages called herself Audrey. She was friendly, she was attentive, and she had reassured Sidney twice that it would just be the two of them. Now, Sidney left her apartment that night, drove roughly 40 minutes south to the small town of Wilber. And the way we know this is her phone pinged near a basement apartment on a quiet residential street, and then it went dark. She never came home. 3 weeks later, searchers walking gravel roads in Nebraska in a rural county called Clay County, they began finding plastic trash bags scattered into ditches. And in those bags were the carefully cut remains of a young woman. 14 pieces in total. One arm still carried a tattoo that read, "Everything will be wonderful someday." Some of her organs were never recovered. Near the bags lay a plastic sauna suit with the crotch cut out, sex toys, a dog leash, latex gloves, and pieces of extension cord. And the woman Sidney believed was Audrey was not Audrey at all. She was a 23-year-old by the name of Bailey Marie Boswell. And waiting inside that Wilbur Basement was Boswell's 50-year-old boyfriend, a longtime fraudster and a con man named Aubrey Trail. Prosecutors would later prove that hours before Sidney ever left work at the Menards store where she was a cashier, Trail and Boswell had already been shopping. Surveillance cameras and receipts would capture them buying hacksaws, tin snips, a utility knife, and extra blades, large quantities of bleach, and the exact brand of trash bags that would later hold her body. Now, while Sidney was still alive and still on the clock, the tools of her dismemberment were already in their possession. So this is a story of how an ordinary Tinder connection became a calculated murder. It's the story of two people who turned a young woman's desire for companionship into a night of strangulation, sexual violence, and methodical disposal of her body. And it's the story of how the Nebraska justice system ultimately decided their fate. Death for one, life without possibility of parole for the other. So let's get into it. And before we talk about the people who took her life, we need to spend some time with the young woman they took from this world. Because if we start with the killers, we're turning Sidney Loof into a plot point rather than into a person. And she was very much a person and deeply loved. She was born on August 21st, 1993 in Broken Bow, Nebraska. Her parents were George and Susie Loof. George, he was an educator through and through, a teacher, a coach, and even later a principal. And Susie, she also worked in education, eventually becoming a special ed teacher. They were the kind of couple who built their lives around schools and their small town community. Now, the family did live for a time in what's known as Arcadia, which is a tiny central Nebraska town and that's where Sidney would spend her earliest years along her older brother, Levi, and later a younger sister named Mackenzie. And these three siblings, they were close. Family members later remembered a childhood full of the simple things that would define rural Nebraska, like swinging on a tree swing, riding bikes to a local pool in the summertime, even sledding in the wintertime, and spending long hours outdoors. Now, Sidney was also known as a tomboy. Her mother, Susie, would later say she could outfish most of her family. She always wanted to tag along with her father and her brother when they went fishing. And the Loofs fished near Yankton, South Dakota, along the Missouri River. Just beautiful areas to see all this wonderful fishing. And those trips became a part of the fabric of this family life that they spent. Sidney, she loved the water, the quiet, the patience of it, and just being outdoors. George would coach her junior high basketball team, and he recalled her as just a natural in sports. He would say she had a great baseline jumper, and she also played golf and was really good at that as well. Teachers and family described her as a girl who was active and very competitive, but all that would change in her teenage years. Sidney would unfortunately develop scoliosis, which is a curvature of the spine, and that made physical activity very painful for her, especially swinging a golf club. Basketball would become difficult, and that active lifestyle that had defined her childhood was largely taken away from her. It was a significant loss for this girl who had defined herself partly through movement and through the outdoors, but fishing would remain, and she would make the best of just a horrible situation for her in her younger years. She was very determined to make the best of that. Now, around the year 2000, the family would move to Nellie, Nebraska, which is a town of roughly 1,500 people. It's in the northeast area of Nebraska, and that became home for them, just this small town of 1,500 people. Sidney would attend the local schools all the way from second grade through graduation in May of 2011. And in a town that size, the school is really the center of life. If you're from a small town, you get that. It's all about high school, Friday night lights, and baseball games in the spring. And that's exactly what it was like there. Now, after graduating in 2011, Sidney began working as a cashier at what was known as Menard's store, and she stayed there for about 2 years. She then transfers to another location of that store that was in Lincoln, Nebraska. And there was a reason for that. Her brother and sister lived in the Lincoln area at the time, and she wanted to be closer to her siblings. Made a lot of sense. It spoke to her family spirit, if you will, and these siblings would stay connected even as adults. Kenzie would come over to watch Netflix, make dinner, and help tidy up because, according to her, Sidney hated cleaning. Levi would be counted on to be there when her car would break down or when she would have problems. And that happened more than once. One time it died 200 yards from where he lived, and he tracked her down and helped her fill the tank to get it running again. She was out of gas. Sidney also raised a cat named Mimsy from a kitten that she had bought off Craigslist, and she adored that cat. Mimsy was still in her apartment without food and water when the family would force entry after she went missing, and that detail would stay with them. She was known as one of the kindest, most polite cashiers. Customers and co-workers would later tell the family how much they loved just seeing her and her big smile, and she worked very hard. And her brother would remember later when she received her first bonus how much pride she beamed with. She felt like her hard work was being rewarded and it was validation, right? But Menards was never the end goal for Sidney. She actually dreamed of working with animals at a veterinary clinic, and she had a soft spot for creatures that needed care and that same softness that she would extend to people. As a matter of fact, on at least 3 occasions that her parents would later recall, Sidney took in people that were struggling. She gave them a place to stay while they worked through problems. And one specific story involved a younger male co-worker who was living in what you would classify as substandard conditions. Sidney would let him stay at her apartment. She taught him how to save money. She helped him with basic hygiene and life skills until he could find a place of his own. And when asked why she would do that for someone that she barely knew, the answer she gave, according to those who knew her, were simple. Everybody needs help at some point in their life. Her brother Levi put it this way: Sidney was the poster person for caring more about others than she did for herself. And that quality, it made her family proud. It also made the later news of what happened to her almost impossible to understand or absorb. That same young woman who had opened her home to help people in need was the one who would be targeted by 2 animals, if you will, who saw her as a means to an end. By 2017, Sidney was 24 years old. She was living in Lincoln. She maintained regular contact with her parents. I'm talking phone calls and texts 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week. And the drive between where her parents lived and Lincoln was about 3 hours. So check-ins mattered. She wasn't just right down the street if you were worried. And she was responsible. She showed up for work all the time, without fail, no exception, was very on time as a person, and friends and family said she didn't simply vanish without explanation ever. Now, despite all that, she was struggling. Susie later recounted that her daughter suffered from anxiety and major depression, and in the days leading up to her disappearance, Sidney would talk to her family about her struggles with mental health. They scheduled a doctor's appointment, drove her to get antidepressants, and that visit was the last time her immediate family would see her in person. The weekend before she went missing, Sidney went back to visit her parents. She spent time with family and friends, and she just had a great weekend. It was the kind of weekend that happens with close families all the time. Now, Sidney also used dating apps like everybody else her age, right? She was looking for connection. She wanted companionship. She wanted someone who saw her and just was blown away by that. She wanted to fall in love, right? In early November of 2017, she matched with a woman who called herself Audrey, and the messages were friendly. Sidney asked careful questions. She made plans. And after the first date, she even told her friend, you know, I may have found my dream girl here. On the evening of November 15th, she posted a Snapchat story that I told you about earlier, where she just put ready for my date with the picture and left her apartment. Her cat Mimsy was there. Her car would still be in the driveway the next day. Her purse, her glasses, the ordinary objects that if you're going to disappear for a little while, you're going to take with you, they were all found inside of her house. But Sidney herself would not return. When she failed to show up for work the next day at Menards, this was on November 16th, her co-workers became worried. They knew her, and they knew this was not like her. Word reached her sister. Her sister then called her parents, and George and Susie would try to reach her. One of the texts that Susie sent to Sidney just read, "Please, Sidney, you're scaring me." Now, by the evening of the 16th, they had reported her missing to the Lincoln Police Department. And the search that would follow would consume the next 3 weeks of their lives, and it would leave a permanent mark on the Nebraska town that had watched Sidney grow up. Now, if Sidney Loof's story is one of relative stability, loving family, rooted in small town Nebraska, Aubrey Trail's life sits at the opposite end of that spectrum. Aubrey was born in 1967, and look, details of his early life are cloudy, but what is clear is that by the age of 17, he was already in serious trouble with the law. He was imprisoned in Tennessee for armed robbery at that age of a motel, and that conviction marked the start of a long pattern of incarceration and release that would stretch across multiple states for decades. Now, the armed robbery is significant, not only because it put him in prison so young, but because it established an early willingness to use force or threat of force in the commission of a crime. He didn't care if he had to pull a gun on somebody. And from that point forward, this guy's record shifted more heavily toward fraud, forgery, and theft. Crimes of deception rather than overt violence. But the capacity for control and intimidation, it never left this guy. And as an adult, Trail would develop a particular specialty: antiques and rare coin collecting fraud. He moved through communities and he would present himself as this knowledgeable coin dealer, right? Someone who understood the value of collectibles and maybe some antiques if they had those. And he would facilitate these high dollar transactions. But in reality, those schemes would involve passing bad checks or inflating what the value of something he was selling was to the point that it was robbery, and he would fabricate deals with people. He's just a total scumbag con artist. And Trail would target antique malls or individual coin collectors. He would present himself as a serious buyer and just screw them out of everything they had. And he didn't just do this in Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Tennessee. He would go all over the place. An Iowa antique store owner later described the frustration of dealing with him as impossible. Now, understand this. Trail was not a successful, legitimate businessman who occasionally maybe stepped outside of the law. This guy was a career criminal. His primary skill was persuading people and lying to them. And he could talk. He could present a version of himself that sounded credible to people that wanted to believe they were dealing with someone somewhat sophisticated. Now, that same skill set, the ability to present this compelling story, to offer financial help or access or position himself as a provider or authority figure, that would later be turned toward young women. In the years leading up to 2017, Trail and a woman named Bailey Boswell would use dating apps and other platforms to draw women in their circles. And they would talk about some strange shit to lure victims. They would talk about witches, a coven, vampires. They would offer financial support in exchange for obedience to a set of rules. And women were recruited 50 Shades of Grey style, right? Rules were imposed, check-ins every few hours, restrictions on other relationships, expectations of sex, and money and housing were offered as incentives. And they would prey on these women that had nothing but vulnerability in front of them. So I brought up Bailey Boswell. Let's talk about her a little bit. Her story begins in a very different place from the one where it eventually ends. And if Aubrey Trail's early years were defined by instability and all his bullshit through the criminal justice system, Bailey's childhood carried, I guess, the markers of a more conventional small-town American life, at least on the surface. She was raised in Leon, Iowa, a quiet community. It was in the southern part of the state, and her biological father was actually murdered when she was still an infant. Now, the circumstances, according to family accounts shared during her sentencing, involved a drug-related dispute, and after his death, Bailey was raised by her mother, Priscilla, and her stepfather, Jeff Boswell, who adopted her. By most descriptions offered by her family, the household that followed was stable and supportive. She had siblings and she seemingly lived a normal life, and she was a standout high school athlete. She excelled in basketball and track. She was fast. She could score points on the basketball court, and she was the kind of player who drew attention from coaches and classmates. Family members and people who knew her in Leon, Iowa, later described her as bubbly, outgoing, popular, the girl who would buy breakfast for her young siblings on the way to school, and seemed to have like a clear, great path ahead of her in life. She even received interest from colleges and was offered a partial scholarship to play basketball. And for a young woman from a small town, that kind of opportunity represents more than just sports. It represents a ticket out, a chance to a different scale of life, a future that feels open. And teachers and community members, they saw a lot of promise in her. I'm telling you, from the outside looking upward, it looked like this girl was going to have just a star-bound life. Now, after high school, that's when things started to unravel for her. Bailey went off toward college with athletics on her mind and a lot of opportunity. Then the supports that had held her began to fray. There are accounts of sexual assault at a party. There are accounts of substance abuse. And there's a destructive relationship that family members would later define as the turning point for her. She became involved with a man named Freddie, and according to her parents and other relatives, he was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive. More than that, they say he coerced her into commercial sex, basically pimped her out. And Bailey was young, and the relationship obviously would accelerate downward. She had a daughter during this period, and as the abuse and the instability continued, custody of the little girl was ultimately placed with relatives. Bailey's parents would describe watching their daughter change. This bubbly, athletic teenager they had known was harder to locate in the young woman who became entangled with this abusive partner and struggling to maintain stability. Now, in 2016, while living in the Cameron, Missouri area, Bailey was fined for possession of drug paraphernalia. No big deal. A minor entry on a criminal record, but it sat beside like a larger picture that her family painted after all this happened. A young woman who had become chaotic, who was using substances and was under the control of someone who exploited her. And by the time she encountered Aubrey Trail, Bailey Boswell, she was in a vulnerable position. This girl had experienced the murder of her biological father before she could even form memories of him. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been in a relationship marked by violence and trafficking, and she had lost primary custody of her child. She was young, financially unstable, and she's looking for security, right? According to statements made through legal proceedings, she sought out a path of a sugar daddy through the classified site Backpage. And this is where the paths of Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail would cross. Trail was older. He was roughly twice her age, but he presented himself as a man with money, with connections, and with the ability to provide a different life for her. And he used names and stories that suggested he was this badass guy, right? And to a young woman who had been exploited and trying to find solid ground, it was a rescue for her. Family members would later say they never had a good feeling about Aubrey Trail. One described him as scum. They noticed the control that Bailey was under, and she would obey just about everything he said. He provided cars for her, housing, money, and in exchange, he expected compliance, check-ins, and the recruitment of young women as he made her rely on this financial dependence. So Bailey eventually moves in with Trail, And they would travel and they would engage in these antique and coin fraud schemes that funded their lifestyle. She became the more approachable face in the recruitment of other women. Trail knew this. He knew if he had a woman there and he was trying to recruit other women, it would be easier for her to do that than him. And they would use Tinder for these recruitments, if you will. So by the summer and fall of 2017, Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell, they were living together in a basement apartment. This is in Wilber, Nebraska. And together they had generated enough income to support a lifestyle that would include hotel stays, casino visits, and the ability to offer housing or cash to young women that they would draw into this circle. Now, one of the more significant schemes that they did involved defrauding a Kansas couple of roughly $375,000 cash in gold coins through a high-value coin deal. And Trail, it would come out later, used the name Alan Russell in that operation. So the Wilbur Basement where they lived, that became the physical center of their operation. It was the place where women were brought, where rules were explained, where the couple's particular blend of crime and control would play out. Trail would position himself as the provider, the authority figure. He was older, experienced, and he had money. Boswell, closer in age to the women they recruited and more approachable on the surface, would serve as that initial point of contact. In the way they would do this, Boswell would create profiles on Tinder and similar platforms. She would use aliases like Audrey, Jenna, and others, and she matched with these young women. They would engage in flirtatious conversation, and they would arrange meetings. And once a connection was established, she would introduce the women to Trail. He was framed as a sugar daddy, and he was the central figure in a group lifestyle that offered financial support in exchange for sex and obedience to them. Now, several women testified under oath about what that lifestyle entailed. One of the most detailed accounts came from a woman identified in court records as Ashley Hills. She described meeting Boswell through the dating app in the summer of 2017 and then being introduced to Trail. Trail told her he could help her get revenge on an abusive stepfather. He spoke of a group of women he called, quote, his girls or witches, and he claimed that there were others already involved. Boswell was referred to as the Queen Witch. Trail described himself at times as a vampire, and he showed Hills nude photographs of women that he claimed were part of the group. The rules, according to testimony, were explicit. Women were expected to check in every few hours by phone or text. They needed permission for ordinary activities like eating. They were not supposed to be involved with other men. And in the apartment, there were expectations around nudity and sexual availability. Financial help, including rent, cash, and stability, was the incentive. And leaving the group was framed as possible until a certain point. That point, according to what Trail told at least one woman, involved, quote, taking a soul, which she understood as killing someone and them taking their last breath. Now, other women offered overlapping accounts. They described conversations about torture and recorded acts of violence, about the possibility of selling videos for large sums of money. One young woman testified she was told she could become the 13th witch if she tortured and killed someone. Prosecutors would later argue these conversations would demonstrate that everything was premeditated and that they had a genuine interest in violence. The defense for both Trail and Boswell would characterize much of it as a dark fantasy. They would say this was role play, it was just talk, it never crossed into concrete planning until, in fact, the night that Sidney Loof died. The jury and the sentencing judges ultimately treated this pattern of related evidence as intent and spoke to the character of these two. So back to the night in question. On November 11th of 2017, Sidney Loof, she matched on Tinder with a woman using the name Audrey, and the profile presented a young woman interested in meeting someone. The early messages are everything you thought. They would talk about food, plans to meet, etc. And Sidney, she was smart enough to ask direct questions, asking whether it would just be the two of them, and Audrey would reassure her, yes, just the two of us. And they had friendly conversation. They arranged a first date for November 14th. Sidney went. She came home safely. Everything was perfect. And afterwards, she even told a friend, hey, I think I found the one. That second meeting was scheduled for the 15th. While Sidney was still at work at Menards in Lincoln that day, Aubrey Trail and Boswell were already moving through stores buying shit. Surveillance videos and receipts would later place them at multiple locations where they bought a folding saw, a weeder, food grinders. At Home Depot, they purchased a foot-long hacksaw, wire snips, drop cloths, a sharp utility knife with extra blades. They also purchased a large quantity of Clorox bleach, 30-gallon trash bags, and all kinds of related cleaning supplies. And cell phone data would add another layer. Trail was captured on camera at the Menards location where Sidney worked. The timing and movement of the couple's phones were consistent with the awareness of Sidney's location and schedule. And prosecutors would later call this monitoring. So Sidney leaves for work that day. She returns to her apartment and she prepares for that second date. She posted that Snapchat story that I told you about where she said, ready for my date, and her phone activity showed movements toward the basement apartment Trail and Boswell shared. The last significant pings occurred in that area around 8:30 that evening, and then the whole phone goes dark. Now, what happened inside that apartment is known through primarily Trail's own shifting statements to investigators, the physical evidence recovered later, and the forensic conclusion drawn from the remains. Trail admitted in multiple interviews that he strangled Sidney with an extension cord, and the accounts would vary over time. Some versions, he claimed the death occurred during a consensual sex act. In others, he said she reacted badly when he revealed the nature of their relationship and he killed her to keep her from talking. And in others, he took primary responsibility while attempting to minimize Boswell's role, depending on who he was talking to. The guy was absolutely crazy. But one thing remained consistent: the method. Strangulation with an electrical cord was the way he killed her. Items recovered near the body and in related searches added a sexual component to the events in the apartment. A plastic sauna suit with the crotch cut out, sex toys, a dog collar, leash, restraints, and other material were found in the proximity of the remains. Prosecutors will argue these were elements of part of the crime itself. In the defense, they would say there's all kinds of things you can interpret from that. After the killing would come the dismemberment. The tools purchased earlier that day, remember the hacksaw, the utility knives, etc., they were consistent with cuts on the body. Now, Sidney's remains were separated into approximately 14 pieces. Some internal organs, including her heart, were never recovered. The pieces were placed in 30-gallon black trash bags that the couple had bought in the work. And believe it or not, these animals had cleaned up so much, the apartment found no blood evidence despite the nature of these injuries. Prosecutors would say this is evidence of the planning, the preparation, and the deliberate cleanup, and I couldn't agree more with that. The bags were then transported roughly an hour west into rural Clay County. They were deposited along gravel roads and in ditches near the town of Edgar, and multiple disposal sites were later identified, 17 in total according to investigative accounts. Some bags were torn or partially open when found. Additional items like tarps with biological material, pieces of the sauna suit, gloves, clothing fragments, and even the extension cord were recovered in the same general area. Now, in the hours and days immediately after this killing, Trail and Boswell did not remain static, if you will. Cell data and hotel records showed a lot of movement. They stayed in various locations, including hotels. They continued some of their ordinary patterns, and they began constructing what I would call a public narrative. When law enforcement eventually named them as people of interest, the couple responded with Facebook Live videos in which they denied involvement, claimed they had spent time with Sidney, and offered an account of dropping her off at a friend's house. Those videos, while attempts at control, ultimately helped investigators locate them. So as I told you, Sidney gets reported on November 16th, 2017. And by that evening, her family had filed a missing persons report with the Lincoln Police Department. Officers would conduct a welfare check, and they would see that her glasses were there, her purse, all the things you would bring if you're leaving. But more than anything else, they noticed Mimsy, her cat, was there without food and water. Everybody knew there's no way that would have happened. So that scene would suggest she had left voluntarily, but intended to return soon. Investigators would reconstruct her last known moments. Friends would identify that Tinder match, and when police looked into that, they found a profile named Audrey. The phone number associated with that account was traced to an application that was linked to Bailey Boswell, and cell tower data would quickly focus the attention on Wilber, Nebraska, and specifically on that basement apartment. When officers and the landlord went to the residence, they noted a strong bleach odor, which is a big red flag. And they also noticed the unusual fact the air conditioner was running, and this was mid-November in a very cold area of the country. No way that would have happened unless it was intentional. So they get a search warrant, they go into the apartment, and it appeared too clean, as if someone had cleaned it to the point you could eat off the floor. There was no blood evidence or really anything obvious that that was a crime scene. So they keep investigating. Trail and Boswell publicly are named as people of interest because they couldn't locate them. And the couple, as I said, responded on Facebook Live with videos denying any involvement. Police were able to work with Facebook to figure out where those videos came from. And on November 30th, 2017, Trail and Boswell are arrested in Branson, Missouri. They were taken into custody primarily on federal fraud charges connected to a Kansas coin scheme because they didn't have enough evidence to charge them yet for this. And on them, they have maps, hiking shoes, and a lot of materials that would suggest they were not planning to go home anytime soon. Now, the critical breakthrough on the body came days later. Lincoln police investigator analysis of cell tower data from the night of November 15th would follow these two down rural roads in Clay County. When they checked out this data, they were able to actually almost find exactly where these bags were based off of that cell tower data. Now, when they found all of this, obviously the case gets transformed from a missing persons case into homicide. Formal charges of first-degree murder and improper disposal of human skeletal remains were filed against both Trail and Boswell. This is in June of 2018, and conspiracy charges were added as well. Trail eventually entered a plea to the improper disposal count, and both maintained not guilty positions on the murder and conspiracy charges. So Aubrey Trail's trial took place in 2019, and the evidence presented was extensive. Store surveillance, everything I told you about, the receipts for the hacksaws, 10 snaps, utility knife, bleach, all that shit. Cell phone data that put this guy at the scene. And Trail's own statements to FBI agents were enough. He couldn't get out of this. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, and they returned guilty verdicts on first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and some related counts. And the moment of the verdict produced one of the most dramatic scenes in Nebraska courtroom history. Trail stood, declared that Bailey Boswell was innocent, cursed the court and the jury, and then used a small razor blade he had concealed to slash his own throat right there in open court. I bet you didn't expect that. But the wounds were not fatal. Medical attention was provided, and he survived and later chose not to attend subsequent proceedings. So Bailey Boswell's trial follows. This is in 2020. Because of extensive pretrial publicity, the venue was moved to what's known as Dawson County. The core evidence mirrored that was presented in the Trail trial. Everything I already told you about. And of course, Bailey Boswell is convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and improper disposal of human remains, and sentencing upcoming. Now, something to say about sentencing. In Nebraska, capital cases are actually handled by a 3-judge panel rather than a trial jury. And that panel must be unanimous in finding an aggravating circumstance has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt before the death sentence can get imposed. In June 2021, the panel considered Aubrey Trail's sentence and found the aggravating circumstances unanimously were proven. And Judge Vicki Johnson, who spoke for the panel, described the crime as involving cold, calculated planning. She noted that Sidney had been selected, lured, killed, and needlessly mutilated in a manner that went beyond what was required to just conceal a body. The judges concluded the manipulation served both intellectual and sexual purposes, and he was sentenced to death. Bailey Boswell's sentence hearing was held in November of 2021. 2 of 3 judges found the stated proven exceptional depravity. They pointed to the planning, the luring of the victim, participating in the killing, and the needless mutilation. The 3rd judge did not join that finding. And because the law in Nebraska must be unanimous for a death sentence, Bailey Boswell ended up with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Of course, appeals would follow. However, all of those were denied. And as of 2026, as it relates to Aubrey Trail, he's still on death row. He's at Tecumseh State Correctional Institution, still doesn't have an execution date. And Boswell, her life sentences also unanimously upheld, and she is serving her sentence at Nebraska Correctional Center for Women in York. Now, for Sidney's family, that legal process brought a measure of finality. Of course, you never get closure. You can get justice to some extent. George and Susie Loofe, along with her siblings Levi and Mackenzie, they sat through all this horrificness of these trials. Just a horrific crime that I brought you today, certainly fitting of 50 Shades of Evil. And in this new world that we live in now, where people don't date like they used to, you meet people on dating apps. You absolutely don't know somebody on a dating app. I can't believe that people focus so much on that. Whatever happened to meeting, you got 5 friends and you're all out dancing or something and you meet somebody. Maybe you meet them at church, whatever. This is how they do it now, and it is extremely dangerous, as you can see, and I'm sure you already know. But there you have it. Sidney Loof, 24 years old, loved fishing, loved her cat, showed up for work, helped other people that were struggling, and was trying, even in the middle of her own difficulties, to find a connection with somebody. On the night of November 15th, 2017, that search ended in a basement apartment in Wilber at the hands of 2 people who had plans from the beginning to kill her. So my thoughts obviously go out to her family and my prayers for what they've been through. I'll be back next week with another episode. And until next time, for Bloody Angola, I'm your host, Jim Chapman. Much love.